Let's take a look at Elizabeth Gross's text, Feminism and the Crisis of Reason. Don't worry if you struggled with this text. Not only are there some difficult concepts in the text, it's pretty heavily weighted with a great deal of philosophical theory, not only from the discipline of feminist philosophy, but also from philosophy more broadly, particularly the continental tradition, including post-structuralism and phenomenology, as well as from psychoanalysis. So if you had a hard time with this text, don't worry too much about it. I'm going to try to make clear some of the main points that Gross is getting at here. First, we'll try to simply understand what Gross means by the crisis of reason and what she's suggesting feminism's relationship is to the crisis of reason and how feminist theorists might respond to the crisis of reason. So let's start by just getting a handle on what she's talking about throughout this essay when she discusses the crisis of reason. What Gross is referring to when she talks about the crisis of reason is the current situation of Western knowledge. Because there's been a privileging of the mind over the body throughout the history of Western knowledge, not only since Descartes, but all the way back to ancient Greece. If you've taken any classes on the ancient Greek philosophers or on Plato, you know that there was a distinction between those things that were real, particularly existing material things, and ideas. So there's a history, at least 2,500 years, of knowledge in the Western world that has made a distinction, and not only a distinction, but a hierarchical distinction between the mind and the body, or ideas and materiality. So this binary has become sedimented in Western knowledge, this binary of the mind being superior to the body. And along with this binary comes the inability to understand the material production of knowledge. That is, to know how knowledge is produced historically in a given time and place, which ultimately leads to what Gross will call the crisis of specificity. So for Gross, this is not only a crisis of reason because we don't have the tools to understand how our knowledge is produced, by whom our knowledge is produced, but there's also a crisis of specificity in the sense that if we can't account for the bodies, the bodiless bodies that are producing and generating knowledge in the Western world, because knowledge is taken to be a kind of pure entity that is produced by bodiless bodies, that is, masculine knowledge is separate from bodies, and therefore we cannot account for the specificities of knowledge production. And so the crisis of reason is a crisis that explains the current situation that we're in terms of trying to understand the production of knowledge without the means to understand the production of knowledge, because knowledge is understood to be separate from the specificities of the real material world. Gross is arguing that there's an opportunity here for feminists because the crisis of reason has shown a crack in. There's an opportunity to both subvert and transform the epistemic hegemony of masculine forms of knowledge that have been pervasive for literally thousands of years. So in Gross's view, knowledge needs to be resexualized, and what she means by that is we need to undermine the conception of knowledge that is based on the sedimented binary of mind over body, and reintroduce bodies into our accounts of the production of knowledge. And by reintroducing bodies, we reintroduce or resexualize knowledge itself. So Gross goes over some of the assumptions that come along with the kind of masculinized knowledge that has been part of the tradition of Western knowledge. And first of these assumptions or presuppositions is that the methods or tools of knowledge are both transparent to knowers and that such resources and methods are separable or separate from the objects of knowledge, from the things that we know. So this means that we can know things about the world, we can know an object of knowledge, and our methods and theories and tools and resources of knowing that thing don't affect what it is that we know. The second presupposition or assumption of a pure knowledge is that there are hard and fast boundaries between epistemic disciplines. So, for example, that the human sciences are distinct from the hard sciences, that psychology is distinct from philosophy. So there's the assumption that the methods, tools, and resources of various disciplines of knowledge are separated by strict boundaries. The third assumption that Gross talks about is that objects of knowledge are real. There's a kind of epistemic realism, that the things that we know about really exist in the world. They're not just objects of knowledge. This has been a thoroughgoing topic of epistemology. And further, that these objects that do exist in the world, separate from knowers, can be verified. It can be verified that they do exist. This is related to what in the history of philosophy has been understood as a kind of empiricism, particularly positivism. The fourth assumption that Gross mentions is that knowledge is taken to be eternally true. So once we know something, that means that it is a justified true belief. If some knowledge claim is true, it is eternally true for all time. The fifth assumption that Gross discusses is that the subjects of knowledge, knowers, are bracketed off from the objects of knowledge, that is, what they know. So on this assumption, knowledge is not perspectival. That is, there's no perspective from which knowledge comes. Any object of knowledge can be known by any subject. Knowledge comes from what has been called the view from nowhere. So this assumption is the assumption that if there's some knowledge claim about some object of knowledge, anyone who is a competent knower can know it. We're going to challenge this assumption directly with the reading by code. So this understanding of pure scientific knowledge that we've had for hundreds and thousands of years in the West has been challenged recently, not only by feminists, but by philosophers of science and epistemologists, including Descartes himself. So there's a sense of skepticism about what we can know, and a crisis in trying to determine or give an account of the production of knowledge. And this crisis has shown that knowledge is not necessarily transparent. The production of knowledge is not necessarily transparent. Knowledge is not necessarily clearly boundaried. Knowledge is not always verifiable, eternally true. And furthermore, that knowledge is in fact perspectival. That is, knowledge is produced from some specific perspective. Knowledge is based on contingencies and specificities. So what has been taken to be pure, eternal, transparent knowledge is actually produced by particular subjects who choose particular methods, particular tools, particular premises from which to start their inquiry, all of which are the products of psychological, social, political, material, and epistemic forces, which are specific and contingent. And so bodies are relevant to the material production of knowledge. Gross talks about two different ways we can look at the importance of bodies to knowledge production. She looks at the post-structural and postmodernist approach that discusses the inscription of social specificities onto bodies. These inscriptions have surface effects, which in turn shape the psychological interiority of knowers. And these surface effects, as well as the interiority, are policed through normalization. We talked about this with respect to the Fausto Sterling account, as well as Ogiemi's account, the kind of biologic at play. And this normalization also involves a kind of medicalized discourse. And so you can think again of the Fausto Sterling reading on the medicalization of intersex infants and how social inscriptions actually affect not only the surface of the body, but the interiority of the body And again, with the readings we did on disability, how social understandings and ideas actually come to shape bodies themselves. And then she also talks about the lived body. So on the one hand, you have the brute constructivist approach from the postmodern and post-structuralist camp that wants to discuss inscription of the social onto the material. And then on the other hand, she talks about the phenomenological and psychoanalytic approach that is concerned more with lived experience. And she discusses how a child's body means something different depending on the sex of the body. So the differences in bodies opens up space for differences in power, differences in culture, and differences in knowledge, which shows that knowledge is an activity. It's not merely something upon which we reflect. It's actively produced, and in the West, it has been actively produced by masculine interest. Again, think back to Beauvoir's account of males perceiving themselves as selves and conceiving of women as others, and othering women, putting women into the role of other. Part of this is the sedimentation of the binary of mind and body, where mind is taken to be hierarchical and man is taken to be a bodiless mind, a pure rational being, and woman is taken to be embodied and irrational. And so knowledge in the Western world has traditionally been a masculinized form of knowledge that has posed woman as body, as other than mind. So knowledge itself has become a kind of pure, disembodied, abstract phenomena in the West. And for this reason, the crisis of reason that we're currently in, this situation in which we cannot identify, which we cannot understand reason itself, that is, we can't use reason to understand the production of knowledge because knowledge has privileged the mind over the body. It has become disembodied, and without the specificities of bodies, we cannot see the material production of knowledge itself. And thus, this crisis of reason is an opportunity to re-sexualize knowledge. That is, if knowledge is contingent, and in the history of the West it has been a masculinized knowledge, there's an opportunity to re-sexualize knowledge, to show that not only is it contingent, but to put bodies squarely back into the production of knowledge, which requires an understanding of who produces knowledge, which bodies produce knowledge, what are the specificities of the bodies involved in knowledge production. So ultimately what Gross is offering here is an account of the situation of the crisis of reason in Western epistemology, and an account of how feminism might re-sexualize knowledge by rejecting the abstract disembodied knowledge of the tradition and bringing bodies back to the center of understanding knowledge production.